Hello, and welcome to episode 31 of That Encyclopedia podcast with your hosts, Jacob and Will.
Hello.
Today on That Encyclopedia podcast, we're going to be talking about poetry a little bit, an art form that has shrunk over the last few decades, but for much of history was considered the apex of literary mastery, particularly in Eastern cultures, and particularly in various Chinese cultures that had emerged over the years. And specifically, we're going to be talking about poetry through the lens of one of the most famous, perhaps the most famous, Chinese poet in all history. His name was Du Fu, and he lived in the Tang dynasty, which was in the 8th century AD. Had you heard of this particular poet before we selected the article, Will?
I don't think so. I'm not familiar with the best of the Western poets, so unfortunately my knowledge of non-Western artists, full stop, of any kind is extremely limited.
So poetry is not really your forte in general?
I would say so. Of the various art forms, I don't know a huge amount about poetry. Obviously, I studied it in English Lit at school, but that gives me mostly I can just remember reading again more Shakespeare.
Well, of course, Shakespeare is one of the most famous Western poets, but Du Fu has been described by Western readers as the Chinese Virgil, Horace, Ovid, Shakespeare, Milton, Burns, Wordsworth, Béranger, Hugo, or Baudelaire, potentially all at once, which to me strikes me as a profound ignorance on the Western part of knowing how to categorize Chinese poets, because that's just a list of famous Western poet names, basically. And I did find it amusing how the article conflated all of them together in an attempt to summarize who Du Fu is, but in so doing has just chucked different poetic styles and time periods into a big pot, and the message is just, oh, he's a good poet in a different way.
Yeah, that sounds a bit of like a ChatGPT article trying to write some sort of intellectual prose about the man.
Yeah, I find it like if it was a quiz question and they were like, who is the Chinese Virgil? You're like, Du Fu. Correct. Who is the Chinese Horace? Du Fu. Correct. Who is the Chinese Ovid? Who is the Chinese Shakespeare? And so on and so forth. It's just a bit of a lazy summary from the article, actually. But that said, the rest of it is quite well written, and he was an interesting character, Du Fu. Would you agree with that?
Yes, he's an interesting character, certainly. Although before I hand anything back to you, I would like to point out a micro factoid here that I don't think I was super aware. I've certainly heard of Ovid before, but he was a Roman poet. Again, actually interesting that when talking about Western poets, we throw in some people from a couple hundred years ago with people a couple thousand years ago, as if there's like immensely tight similarities there, as if they're all the same. Also, did you know that there is a medical database of research papers called Ovid?
I have heard of the Ovid database. I didn't know specifically it was for medical research papers. So
you never know, it might have more sections than that. I'm only aware of Ovid Medline. But yeah, there you
was
are.
Ovid Was Ovid a physician as well as
yeah,
a poet?
was a famous medical librarian. No, I don't think there's no obvious relationship to me, but I don't know anything about Ovid.
Well, a good little factoid.
A nice little boring little tangent there for all our listeners.
I mean, Wikipedia is basically designed to be a series of rabbit holes, and you never know where they might take you. For example, there's a line in the technical excellence section of the Du Fu article that states, although he wrote in all poetic forms, Du Fu is best known for his Lu Shi, a type of poem with strict constraints on form and content. I was curious about what the description of this kind of poetry might be, so I went down the rabbit hole and followed the article. It links to an article called Shi brackets poetry, which is just the Chinese character that means poetry in the general sense. And in that article, it defined broadly in the Chinese language 2 forms of poetry: ancient poetry and modern poetry. Would you like to take a guess at when modern poetry, in the Chinese sense, begins?
Oh dear, it's gonna be something, certainly. Let's throw in an extra few hundred years from what we might expect and say 1,000 years ago.
1,500 years ago.
Okay, yeah, there we are.
Any Chinese poetry emerging from the 5th century onwards, so the year 400 onwards, really, 1,600 years ago, is considered a modern poet, which means that Du Fu, despite having lived in the years 712 to 770, about 1,300 years ago, is considered a modern poet under the Chinese literary definition.
Nice.
But I think maybe there is some justification in that, because he writes about very modern grievances. The article contains some examples of his poetry.
Yes.
Did you enjoy these? I found them
yes,
quite engaging.
I'm sure I know which one is your favourite.
Indeed, I will read it. It is only 2 lines, and it is a poem called Early Autumn, Miserable Heat, Papers Piling Up. And it reads as follows in English. I am about to scream madly in the office, especially when they bring more papers to pile higher on my desk. That's it. I loved it.
Some context to this poem. This was when he'd been demoted in government to a post as a commissioner of education, and apparently he did not enjoy the endless bureaucracy of his job. But before we go on to discuss further, I think I'll just point out something about the poetry of Du Fu and some of the challenges that come with being, say, like I am. I'm a native English speaker, and I'm only really familiar with the English language. When it comes to an art form like poetry, if you're at all familiar with the variety of forms of poetry that exist in English, one can imagine the challenge of translating some of these into another language for someone else to interpret. And I think possibly more so if we're talking about a poem written over 1,000 years ago by a gentleman in modern day China. It might be fair to say that some meaning or rhythms, intonations, rhyming, even some of the actual meaning of some of the particular choices of words or phrases might be slightly lost to us. So I guess all the more amusing that this 2-line poem resonates perfectly with the work in the modern day as it did then for him.
I think you make a good point, and it's certainly a challenge in the sense that I speak a little bit of Mandarin, but not enough to really translate poetry effectively. And even if I were fluent in modern Mandarin, this is and not the poems are not written in Mandarin. This is an ancient form of Chinese from over 1,000 years ago, and this makes the question of translation extremely pertinent to bring poetic works to a modern audience. That said, the fact that I can read the translated poems revised in English and still find them very effective is a testament not only to Du Fu as a poet, but also to the people responsible for translating his work
Yes.
Into my own mother tongue.
I think so.
I also want to point out to people that China has a long and storied history, and the earliest records of sort of Chinese society in its various dynasties and forms go back to the 11th century BC. So in comparison with, for example, the UK, our earliest kind of modern records often come from the Christian Church, and they're very, very patchy until about the time of Alfred the Great. And indeed, one of the reasons why he's considered the Great is because he helped to document things that he did, and so historians like him a lot because it means we know a lot about society and his life. The reason why I'm going off on this slight tangent is because I think it's easy for us, particularly as Westerners, to underestimate how developed Chinese culture and society was. Or maybe developed is a loaded word, maybe organized and documented is a better word, at this time. Because to me, saying, oh, he lived in the 8th century AD, basically leads to this assumption that we know, almost nothing about him, or we have to speculate about a lot. But it couldn't be further from the truth. He lived in the Tang dynasty of China, and around its kind of high point just after the interregnum. And at the time, its population was comparable to the population of the UK today. So society needed to be extremely well organized to administer what has been throughout history, historically, and continues to be today, the most populous part of the whole world. And to that end, Du Fu spent most of his life as a kind of standard career bureaucrat and civil servant in various government postings. Now, there are differences, such as a civil war or two that broke out in his time. They were a lot more common back in the 8th century AD than they might be today, but even still, at bottom line, a government bureaucrat, just like today.
Yes. Speaking of the Civil War, I mean, there was a particular rebellion, the An Lushan rebellion of 755 to 763, so an 8-year civil war that had probably quite a significant influence on Du Fu. I mean, it must have in one way or another, given that he was living there at the time, and the impact of the civil war on society appears frankly to have been colossal. So just for reference, in the year just before the war started, there was a census counting around 53 million people, and in around 764 there was a census that counted around 17 million people. So we've gone from 53 countable individuals to 17 million countable individuals. So the number of people in society displaced or killed in this civil war is just absurd, is colossal, and is a sign of just how much it would have turned upside down the lives of people in the region at the time.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, I mean, obviously, such a huge drop doesn't necessarily mean that everyone was,
Yes.
Killed or anything, but it is a testament to how disruptive it was to the bureaucracy and to the administration, and to that end, Du Fu was himself arrested on more than one occasion.
Yeah.
He was never imprisoned or exiled or executed or anything like that. He lived a reasonably long life, actually. He died in his late 50s, either 57 or 58 years old, whilst sailing on the Yangtze River. So he did quite well for himself. But I agree, his family, his career, his poetry were all deeply affected by this civil war that weakened the political dynasty. And at the time of his death, the leader of the dynasty would be the last emperor before the ultimate collapse of his country, as he would have understood it. And actually, to be slightly tangential, that's really the history of China, from a broad historiographic sense. The history of China as a kind of contiguous place of, in terms of ethnicity and cultural practice, as opposed to individual political states, has been these aforementioned states coming together and uniting in increasingly powerful empires led by small family dynasties under different titles, doing extremely well for a period. Sometimes it's only a couple of years, sometimes it's a couple of decades, sometimes it's a few centuries, and then ultimately it shatters into dozens of competing states, and then it slowly pieces itself together, and this growth, unity, and breaking has, in a cyclical fashion, has described China for its entire history, basically, which is interesting. It's sort of stability and instability, just this endless, repeated cycle over time. And Du Fu was just unfortunate. Well, he was unfortunate in that he lived through a rebellion, but he didn't actually live through the breaking of his own dynasty, but he did see it weaken over the course of his life.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine a world where that does not impact a government bureaucrat in a marked way, and therefore subsequently influencing his works, especially the works of his later life, and some of his maybe more sentimental, or be that from him or to others, pieces of work that focus on a moral engagement, let's say, because that's the heading used in the article. So he does have some work focusing on a compassionate train of thought. So he wrote a piece of work called the Song of the Wagons, and this is described as giving voice to the sufferings of a conscript soldier in the Imperial Army, and is described as a clear-sighted consciousness of suffering. Although that said, I may have just cited a piece of work he wrote before the Civil War. So it was apparently one of his earliest surviving works. So I don't have, unless I go into the reference, I don't know exactly which date that was. But that said, my point still stands that descriptively, people, so they say, would suggest that the things that he saw in war, the wisdom he acquired from the suffering of war, would have come across in some of his poetry.
I agree. Yeah, this word compassion comes up quite a lot. He's considered a compassionate poet, but he manages to sort of blend compassion through a style of simple factual reporting. So the article tells us clearly, along with another Chinese poet, with Li Bai, who actually he knew and was friends with. They lived around the same time. He is considered one of the greatest Chinese poets of all time, and in a place like China with 3,000 years of recorded history, there have been many poets competing for that title, and anyone who is not kind of intimately familiar with his work, literary terms, and I would say yes, probably his own native language, in as much as one can be, would struggle to be an authority on the figure. So the article is really all we have to go off. But at the same time, you can make an argument that poetry is a very personal, subjective thing, and from that authoritative perspective, I have enjoyed reading his translated works. I looked at a few poems. The article has a few examples. Some are very short, some are a bit longer, and they're strict in form. They're good in their style, and I would encourage people to have a look if they want to engage in some poetry, and then show off to their friends that they're familiar with this 1,000-year dead Chinese master of the art. Of course.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I also wanted to just point out this tiny little section to you, Will, under health.
Yes.
It's only one sentence. It also describes how he died. It says, Du Fu is the first person in the historical record identified as a diabetic patient. In his two sentences. In his later years, he suffered from diabetes and pulmonary tuberculosis and died on board a ship on the Yangtze River, aged 58 years old. This source comes from an article published in the Journal of the Japanese Association of Rural Medicine, and it's published in Japanese, so I'm not able to read it, in 1990. And I'm not sure, therefore, if what it's referring to when it says Du Fu is the first recorded diabetic patient, because diabetes as a disease was familiar to the ancient Egyptians thousands of years before Du Fu lived. So it might mean in China. I'm not entirely sure, but what did you make of this tiny health section?
Well, I'm not sure what to make of it, because I'm surprised that this is mentioned. This is the sentence in health, right? But let me say, Control F on the page, and search asthma in the page. Oh
yeah, of course. It was
right?
Possibly asthmatic, yeah.
So there's a section called health. However, if you look in the early years section about Du Fu, there's a different sentence in a different paragraph that suggests from the year 754. I'm not sure how old he was then, born 712, so in his 40s. He began to have lung problems, in brackets, probably asthma. Not sure why they're saying probably asthma. The first of a series of ailments which dogged him for the rest of his life. So, I guess I'm intrigued, and it's a shame I'd be interested in reading this article if it was a bit easier to translate. There is an abstract that's come up in English when I click on it, but, when you've got an article making very specific claims and you can't check its own reference section, you have to just be like, well, I guess that's an interesting possibility suggested by Wikipedia there.
Yeah.
Because I
Absolutely.
mean, frankly, in the modern day, we don't, we wouldn't say someone presenting with symptoms or described as having signs of a condition. I wouldn't necessarily put my foot down there and say this is what they have. I mean, we have a role for gold standard diagnostic testing in modern medicine, but interesting nonetheless to look at disease in the record of history.
Absolutely. I think something else that this actually gives us an opportunity to talk about is like the fact that Wikipedia is not just English. Of course, we're an English-speaking podcast, and so we only really consider the English articles. But this is like for a Chinese poet, like the Mandarin article will contain details that are not necessarily read across into other languages, and Wikipedia actually does have a function to suggest which languages to read the article in. I don't know on what basis it makes the suggestion, whether it's based on article length in that language or number of citations or frequency of edits. I'm not actually sure. For whatever reason, aside from English, it suggests reading the article in Mandarin, which makes sense, and then also Italian, for no particular reason that I can figure out. But
maybe some
the
good
Italian
literary
section,
scholars or historians.
Yeah, I mean, the Italian section does have a rather lengthy discussion of Du Fu's literary influence that is not translated across in the English section. So if people read Italian, that would be a useful thing to talk about. But that's just one example, and you could do this with any article. So if you do speak multiple languages, do check out what gems might be hidden in one article's various parallel companions.
One point I would like to catch you on before we wrap up. I just thought it was interesting to read the sort of facts about his life, and then a little bit of the take on it. Let's see if I can find it. It's probably in the early years section. So, as we've said, Du Fu was always he went to school to learn about a standard education for a future civil servant, right? And from his legacy in poetry, one might expect to describe him as a genius, maybe.
Sure.
A very talented, possibly very intelligent person, which is why, to the intrigue of some, he actually failed a exam to get into the civil service the first time he took it. He failed it the second time as well, although we'll give him a pass on that one, because every candidate that year failed the exam due to the Prime Minister deciding to fail them, which it claims was to, in the article, was apparently to prevent the emergence of future rivals, which is an interesting thing to do, just fail everyone in their progression to becoming a civil servant. But I think it's interesting to talk about someone like who is described as esteemed and talented, and to discuss the fact that we can see here that there is historical record of him failing a test, failing an exam, okay, and how, what does it say? What did it say about it? I remember reading.
It said
something.
It said that it was to the surprise of his critics centuries later, and they
yes.
suggested that it was because his prose style was too dense and obscure.
Okay.
So basically they're kind of being like, well, he's just too good for the examiners to understand his brilliance.
Yes, I thought that was very interesting that they said that, because although I can say, yeah, that might be the case, but I don't know. I feel like we have this tendency to look at someone, especially given that his talent was for a literary subject. Might have this tendency to want to presume that he must have been a genius. He can't have failed an exam, right? He took an exam. He should have passed it. If the exam was good, he should have passed it. You know, maybe he didn't revise enough. Have we talked about that? Like, we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Even geniuses, you know, if they don't put the work in, cannot convey their brilliance properly.
Yeah, and then even like being extremely talented at one thing doesn't automatically confer talent in something even semi-related. I mean, I found it funny because I feel like this comes up a lot with the very successful and very famous, especially of history, that we tend to like presume that they must have had an array of excellent, super intelligent, super morally sound beliefs and would have been able to pass any intelligence or knowledge test put to them. But I mean, they're human like everyone else. And that, I mean, surely we must remember that from what is conveyed in the poetry written by one human man about the experience of humanity. He was indeed human as well.
Absolutely. A fun fact about the this exam that he took was actually is quite a famous piece of administration in China. It's called the imperial examination. It was developed the dynasty prior to Du Fu's, but by the time of the Tang dynasty, it was quite well segmented. And although all Chinese men were theoretically eligible to take the exam, in practice, candidates were divided according to their sort of social class. So there were 5. There were scholars at the top, and then farmers, artisans, and merchants. But the 5th group was for everyone else, which the article on the imperial examination includes beggars, sex workers, entertainers, slaves, and low-level bureaucrats. And these people were collectively called mean people, the mean people group.
Wow.
That's my, yeah. Yep.
Okay.
So
yeah,
that's
just a little bit judgmental, but sure.
Yep. But with this little tidbit on the imperial examination, I think that more or less concludes our discussion of Du Fu and of this fascinating voice and lens into a bit of ancient Chinese history, but modern Chinese poetry.
Yeah, I hope you all enjoyed contemplating the life and times of someone similar to us, but also from a very different place.
Thank you very much for listening.